What unfolds when the ancient arts of entrenchment, perfected through centuries of warfare, are thrust onto the unforgiving stage of a hyper-connected, rapidly evolving battlefield? What happens when the wisdom of the past collides with the relentless innovation of the present and the future? The fall of Pokrovske offers answers, but only if we dig deep enough to unearth its full significance. By the crisp afternoons of autumn in the year 2025, Pokrovske had transformed far beyond its humble origins as a village in the Donbass. It was no longer just a cluster of homes and fields. It was the heart of Ukraine's iron defense, the nation's pride, and the symbol of its stubborn resilience. Pokrovske became, quite literally, a fortress city. Its reputation was forged in blood and grit, its name whispered with reverence across front lines and in distant capitals alike. The landscape around Pokrovske had changed dramatically. Interlocking trenches snaked for kilometer after kilometer, burrowing deep into the earth. The trenches were not mere ditches, but complex labyrinths, reinforced with concrete, sandbags, and timber. Bunkers, some dug more than 2 stories underground, hid command posts and ammunition stores. Fields bristled with mines, anti-tank, anti-personnel, even remotely detonated traps triggered from a safe distance. Above ground, the shattered skeletons of buildings provided sniper nests and machine gun emplacements, while below, tunnels linked defensive positions in a concealed web that allowed defenders to move unseen. To understand the full depth of Pokrovske's defenses, consider the historical parallels. In World War I, the trench lines of the Western Front stretched for hundreds of kilometers, protected by barbed wire and machine guns. At Verdun, at the Somme, at Passchendaele, armies learned painfully that frontal assaults against fortified positions led only to massacre and stalemate. Yet even those immense lines would be dwarfed by the sophistication of Pokrovske's defense. Here, modern technology fused with classic tactics, as surveillance drones hovered over the no-man's land, and networked sensors alerted defenders to every movement. For months, every Russian attack against Pokrovske ended in bloody deadlock. Artillery barrages churned the earth, but Ukrainian defenders held firm. Night raids were met with flares, gunfire, and counterattacks. Even attempts to bypass the town were stymied by secondary lines of defense, each as formidable as the first. Ukrainian soldiers, many of them veterans from earlier battles in the Donbass, fought with a tenacity born of desperation and belief. The legend of Pokrovske grew, a beacon of hope for Ukraine and a grim warning to its enemies. Russian commanders faced a harsh lesson. The time-honored playbook, overwhelmed the enemy with massed troops and relentless artillery, broke against the walls of Pokrovske. Each renewed assault cost hundreds, sometimes thousands, of Russian soldiers. The fields around the fortress became graveyards of men and machines. One senior Russian officer, recalling the carnage at the Battle of Stalingrad in World War II, reportedly remarked, "We have learned nothing from history if we repeat this." The stakes at Pokrovske were immense and multifaceted. For Ukraine, the town was not merely a strategic position, it was a linchpin of morale. Its defense rallied civilians, inspired international support, and convinced soldiers across the country that victory was possible. Its loss, by contrast, would echo far beyond the battlefield. It would threaten to unravel the faith in Ukraine's defensive doctrine, potentially fracturing the will to resist at all. For Russia, the cost of failure was equally grave. Every failed assault sapped morale, eroded the confidence of commanders, and wasted precious resources. International observers began to question the competence of Russian leadership, and even Russia's own soldiers whispered doubts. The psychological impact of repeated defeat at Pokrovske threatened to undermine the broader campaign in the Donbass. It was clear. The outcome at Pokrovske would not only shape the next phase of the war, but would also reverberate in military academies, government offices, and war rooms around the world. What followed would test not only the steel of armies, but the very assumptions underpinning modern warfare. So how did Pokrovske change from an unbreakable fortress to the scene of one of the most stunning collapses in 21st century warfare? To answer this, we must first peel back the layers of its defense and trace the evolution of siege and assault tactics through history. Let us step inside the heart of the fortress, into the dirt, the shadows, the humming tension of a city waiting for the blow to fall. Only by seeing the world as its defenders did can we truly grasp the audacity and devastation of the coming assault. Pokrovske's defenses were more than mere lines on a map. They were an ecosystem, a living, breathing network of obstacles, sensors, and determined fighters. Imagine the Maginot Line in France, built in the years before World War II. An enormous chain of bunkers, forts, and subterranean tunnels designed to halt any German invasion. Yet, as history showed, even the strongest walls are only as useful as their ability to adapt. In Pokrovske, adaptation was the name of the game. Ukrainian engineers and soldiers constantly modified their positions. Where a trench was destroyed by shellfire, a new one was dug overnight. When drone attacks became frequent, defenders rigged up camouflage nets and deployed electronic jammers. Snipers moved between ruins, changing positions to avoid counter-sniper fire. Supplies, food, water, ammunition were ferried in through tunnels and at night, under cover of darkness and electronic deception. The defenders were disciplined and resourceful. Units rotated frequently, ensuring no one spent too long on the front line. Medical teams, often volunteers, braved shellfire to evacuate the wounded. Small quadcopters, bought off the shelf and modified, provided real-time intelligence. In many ways, Pokrovske's defense was a model of how modern armies could learn from the past while leveraging the tools of the present. Yet the air above Pokrovske vibrated with a new danger. First-person view attack drones, guided by operators miles away, prowled the skies. These drones, small and cheap compared to traditional aircraft, struck with pinpoint accuracy, targeting vehicles, bunkers, and even individual soldiers. The electronic spectrum became a battleground of its own, as Ukrainian and Russian teams dueled with jammers, spoofers, and eavesdropping equipment. Every hour brought new threats, new tactics, and new surprises. For the Russian commanders, the situation demanded a radical rethink. Traditional methods, massive frontal assaults, saturation bombardments, had failed. A direct charge against Pokrovske was a recipe for disaster, as the casualties of previous months had proven. Pokrovske had become a psychological pivot point. To lose here was to lose face, perhaps even the war's momentum. To win, something new was needed. This dilemma echoes an age-old lesson from military history. In 1940, the French army believed its Maginot Line would stop any German advance. But the Germans, rather than crashing headlong into the fortresses, swept through the Ardennes forest, outflanking the line and rendering it irrelevant. In the same way, Russian planners began to ask, what if instead of battering Pokrovske head-on, they could sidestep its strengths and exploit its hidden weaknesses? A new doctrine began to take shape, quietly, in command tents far from the front. Instead of overwhelming force, the Russian command would pursue subversion and surprise. The goal was not to capture every trench, but to punch a single surgical hole in the line, then drive deep behind the Ukrainian positions, sowing chaos and collapse. The plan was bold and risky. It required three key elements, each drawn from the lessons of both past and present wars. First, establish absolute fire superiority over the chosen sector. This meant massing artillery, rocket launchers, thermobaric weapons, and even heavy flamethrowers in unprecedented numbers. The aim was not just to suppress, but to annihilate any Ukrainian resistance in the breach zone. Second, neutralize Ukraine's most recent innovation, the widespread use of first-person view, FPV drones. These had been a game-changer, allowing defenders to spot, target, and destroy Russian units with lethal precision. To counter this, Russian electronic warfare teams would blanket the area with jamming and signal disruption, blinding the Ukrainian drone operators and cutting their eyes from the sky. Third, deploy mobile assault teams, specially trained, lightly equipped, and coordinated via real-time communications to exploit the breach. Their task was not to seize every inch of ground, but to move fast, bypass strong points, and reach deep behind Ukrainian lines to disrupt command and supply. The operation began with a thunderclap. In the pre-dawn gloom, at exactly 4 o'clock, hundreds of artillery pieces opened fire in perfect synchronization. The bombardment did not let up for hours. Shells of every type pounded the trenches, bunkers, and rear positions. In the opening minutes, the density of fire reached 200 guns per kilometer, a figure rivaling the greatest barrages of World War I. Guided artillery rounds, like the Russian Krasnopol system, struck with surgical precision, collapsing dugouts and eliminating command posts. Layered atop this hellish bombardment, rocket artillery and thermobaric weapons ignited the sky. Buildings vanished in fireballs, while deep bunkers caved in from concussion waves. The defenders, stunned and isolated, lost their ability to coordinate. Meanwhile, Russian electronic warfare teams activated their jammers, flooding the spectrum with noise and confusion. Ukrainian drones fell from the sky, their signals lost. Radios turned to static. Orders from headquarters never reached the front. The defenders, once so well coordinated, found themselves fighting blind. At the same time, Russian reconnaissance units, both on the ground and in the air, scanned for gaps in surviving defenders. Special forces teams crept forward, marking safe lanes through the minefields. Sappers followed, clearing paths at enormous personal risk. Every step could mean death, but every cleared path was a lifeline for the assault teams waiting behind. Once the breach was opened, the mobile assault groups surged forward. These were not lumbering columns, but fast, agile units, infantry and armored vehicles, supported by drones and real-time satellite feeds. Their orders were simple: bypass resistance, encircle strong points, and push as deep as possible before the defenders could recover. Where Ukrainian defenders expected a siege, they faced a whirlwind. The risks were immense. Failure would mean not only defeat, but disaster. Mobile units cut off and destroyed, the offensive momentum lost, and the entire operation exposed to counterattack. But with meticulous planning, overwhelming firepower, and technological superiority, the Russians gambled and won. Within hours, the Ukrainian line began to buckle. Commanders, struggling to re-establish communications, realized too late that the Russians were already behind them, cutting supply and retreat routes. Panic spread. Units that had endured months of bombardment and attack suddenly found themselves isolated, with no orders and no way out. This moment, when the breach became a rout, is a critical turning point in military history. It mirrors the German blitzkrieg tactics of 1940, when rapid, coordinated armored thrusts shattered the French defense. It also recalls the collapse of the Soviet defense at Kharkiv in 1943, when a breakthrough in one sector unraveled an entire front. As the breach widened, Ukrainian reserves, armored and mechanized brigades, rushed to plug the gap. But every kilometer toward the front was a gauntlet of danger. Russian electronic warfare blanketed the area, severing units from their commanders. Radios were silent, drone feeds gone. Orders dissolved into confusion. Russian reconnaissance units, aided by drones and satellites, tracked every Ukrainian movement. Strike aircraft and attack helicopters launched missiles from long range, destroying columns before they could reach the breach. On the ground, anti-tank teams ambushed stragglers with guided missiles and artillery. The Ukrainian counterattack, so formidable on paper, was bled dry before it ever reached the front. Perhaps the most profound damage was psychological. Ukrainian command, accustomed to centralized top-down orders, found itself paralyzed. Brigade and battalion commanders, isolated from headquarters, waited for instructions that never came. Initiative withered. Uncertainty spread. As one Ukrainian officer later recalled, it was as if the entire army had gone blind and deaf at once. By the time the scope of the disaster was clear, it was already too late. Reserves were decimated, the front line exposed, and the Pokrovske grouping faced not just defeat, but the nightmare of encirclement and total destruction. The world's military observers took notice. In less than a day, A fortress that had withstood months of siege collapsed into chaos. The implications were enormous. As Russian second-echelon armored columns poured through the breach west of Pokrovske, they did not stop to regroup. Instead, they pressed forward with relentless speed, mirroring the Soviet advances at Kursk in 1943, or the American breakout at St. Lo in 1944. Their goal: encircle the 15,000 Ukrainian defenders who had, mere hours earlier, trusted in their line's invulnerability. Russian strike groups targeted the arteries of resistance, communications and supply routes. Artillery pummeled bridges, crossroads, and rear areas. Airstrikes severed escape corridors. Electronic warfare units jammed what little remained of Ukrainian radio traffic, while loitering drones hunted command posts, intercepting and destroying orders as they were issued. Panic spread like wildfire. With each passing hour, escape routes vanished. Leaders, isolated from their men, faltered. Trench by trench, confusion shattered discipline. Some units surrendered en masse, hoping for mercy. Others attempted desperate, fragmented retreats. Battalions that had held for months unraveled in minutes, undone by the invisible force of isolation and fear. The Russian encirclement was methodical. Mechanized units formed inner and outer rings, tightening the noose, intercepting reinforcements, and trapping fleeing stragglers. Every attempt to break out met overwhelming firepower or swift armored counterattacks. The shrinking pocket forced survivors into ever smaller strongholds, where resistance flickered out in scattered, desperate clashes. Victory at Pokrovske did not depend on sheer numbers or brute strength. It was the result of a finely tuned integration: devastating artillery, rapid armored thrusts, synchronized electronic warfare, drone reconnaissance, and flexible command. This was not the war of the past, but the war of the future, networked, adaptive, and relentless. The lessons for military strategists are profound. The Pokrovske offensive laid bare the fatal weaknesses of static, fortress-style defense. Even when bristling with sensors, mines, and remote-controlled weapons, strong points can quickly become traps if isolated and outmaneuvered by an agile, networked enemy. In a single day, doctrines honed over decades and billions in investments were rendered obsolete. The cost of failure to adapt was staggering, not just in lost soldiers and ruined equipment, but in shattered reputations and collapsed military philosophies. The shock waves rippled through command centers and government offices far beyond the battlefield, forcing a hard reckoning about what it takes to survive, let alone win, in the wars of the future. So what does Pokrovske mean for the next war? The answers, and the warnings, are already shaping how every serious military in the world is preparing for what comes next. Military analysts everywhere pored over the details of the operation. How had such a formidable defense, built with the lessons of history and the tools of today, fallen so quickly? The answer lay not in the size of the forces, but in the speed of adaptation and the integration of technology. Pokrovske's defeat sends a clear message: do not fight the last war. In the past, armies built bigger guns and thicker walls in the hope of outlasting their enemies. The Maginot Line, the Siegfried Line, the Stalin Line, all were masterpieces of fortification, and all were bypassed or destroyed by more mobile, flexible opponents. In the 21st century, the same principle holds true. The modern battlefield punishes rigidity and rewards speed, innovation, and adaptability. Let us examine some concrete examples of what this means in practice. During the Battle of Mosul in 2016, ISIS fighters used an elaborate network of tunnels and barricades to hold off Iraqi and coalition forces for months. Yet, once coalition units adapted, combining air power, drones, electronic warfare, and fast-moving infantry, the defenders' static positions became liabilities. They were isolated, bypassed, and destroyed in detail. Similarly, in the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh in 2020, the Azerbaijani military used drones and electronic warfare to neutralize Armenian artillery and air defenses. Armenian fortifications, once considered impregnable, were rendered useless by loitering munitions and relentless jamming. The lesson: technology and adaptation, not brute force, shaped the outcome. For commanders and policymakers, the lesson of Pokrovske is stark. Betting everything on old doctrines, on massed numbers, fixed fortifications, or centralized command, is now a recipe for defeat. The Russians at Pokrovske did not rely on firepower alone. They synchronized electronic warfare, aerial reconnaissance, real-time intelligence, and rapid maneuver. Every asset, from satellites to sappers, was woven into a single, adaptive effort. Speed was decisive. Russian units identified weak points, launched synchronized strikes, and exploited openings before defenders could respond. Ukrainian troops, though well-prepared and deeply entrenched, saw their communications and control collapse within hours. Their formidable system was outpaced and outmaneuvered. This is the new face of conflict, one where integrated technology and agile, well-drilled units trump static lines and brute force. Pokrovske proved that failure to adapt can doom not only frontline troops, but entire command structures, and even national reputations. The cost is not just in lost ground, but in shattered operational prestige and the psychological scars that will echo through future campaigns. The risks are enormous. Decades of investment and billions in defense spending can vanish overnight if poured into obsolete methods. The collapse of a single stronghold, meticulously prepared and fiercely defended, can undermine morale across the front and sow doubt in capitals far from the battlefield. Every misstep now reverberates beyond the line of contact, shaping doctrine, budgets, and national resolve for years to come. Pokrovske is not merely a case study, it is a warning. The battlefield now favors those who outthink, outpace, and outmaneuver. Rigid, predictable responses are punished instantly. Only adaptability, the integration of cutting-edge technology, and swift, unified command can seize and hold the initiative. What practical steps can militaries take to learn from Pokrovske? First, invest in flexible command structures. Train junior officers and NCOs to act on initiative, not just orders from above. Second, make electronic warfare and counter-drone measures a core part of every operation. Third, prioritize intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, drones, satellites, and human scouts, to maintain situational awareness even when communications break down. Fourth, avoid the temptation to build static, invulnerable defenses. Instead, prepare to maneuver, to yield ground when necessary, and to strike back where the enemy is weakest. Fifth, continuously train for the unexpected. War is now a contest of adaptation. The side that learns and innovates fastest wins. Historical parallels abound. In the Pacific theater of World War II, American forces faced Japanese island fortresses, heavily fortified, tunneled, and mined. Early attempts at direct assault led to high casualties. Over time, the Americans adapted, using bypass tactics, siege, and overwhelming firepower to isolate and neutralize strongpoints. The lesson: even the strongest fortress can fall if its defenders are isolated and outmaneuvered. For future wars, the implication is clear: adapt, innovate, and integrate, or risk irrelevance. Modern conflict is about shaping the fight, disrupting the enemy's system, and striking with overwhelming speed at their weakest point. It is no longer about holding ground for its own sake, but about denying the enemy stability and initiative. The next turning point, the next Pokrovske, will belong not to the force with the thickest armor or the deepest bunkers, but to the side that learns, adapts, and strikes first, defining the future of warfare in the process. So, as the echoes of Pokrovske's fall fade into the history books, militaries around the world face a stark choice. Will they learn the lessons of adaptability and integration? Will they prepare for a future where speed and innovation matter more than mass and tradition? Or will they, like so many before them, build new fortresses only to watch them crumble before the next wave of change? The answer, and the fate of countless soldiers and nations, hangs in the balance, waiting for those bold enough to adapt before it is too late.